Hello, my name is Malcolm Gladwell. I am here with Alex Hutchinson, the author of the fabulous book Endure, which I'm happy to be here discussing with you, Alex. I like this book so much, in fact, I wrote the foreword, or at least you asked me to write the foreword. And it is a really wonderful book. And the first point I wanted to make was, although you're a runner and I'm a runner, it's not a running book.
That is definitely something I want to make clear, is that it started because I was a runner.
Yeah.
My interest in endurance definitely came from the fact that I'm a 100% running nerd. I wanted to know why I couldn't go faster, or what I could do to go faster. But as I sort of explored this question, it became a much, much broader question. While I was writing the proposal to this book, I had my first daughter. While I was writing the book, I had my second daughter. Endurance means something very different when you've been up for 3 nights in a row. And what I realized is that it's really a kind of a universal thing. The desire to be able to continue to keep going when everything is telling you to stop. So that's what I've ended up exploring, is not just how to run faster, but kind of how do we endure.
Yeah. So it's fair to say, I mean, in reading this book, one of the unexpected things I learned was that we probably spend too much time differentiating among endurance tasks as opposed to wondering what they all have in common.
You can look at a spectrum of different activities, whether it's cognitive activities or physical activities, and whether they're short duration or long duration. And fundamentally, what a lot of things have in common is that you kind of have to hold your finger in the flame. You have to resist your impulse to pull it away, or whatever your first impulse is. And I think that is kind of a unifying theme that brings together great athletes, great performers in business and other contexts. And it's actually, when you think about great athletes, we often think about physiological measurements, like who's got the biggest VO2 max, who's got the fastest 40-yard time. But you can actually do cognitive tests on great athletes, and they are different than the rest of us. They can perform better on computerized tests of mental fatigue resistance.
I thought of that when I was listening to a podcast, the Lance Armstrong podcast, Forward, and he had on a number of his former riding mates, several of his teammates from the glory years, and they were all talking, they were sort of reminiscing about what it was like to be on the Tour de France. And they started talking about these brutal climbs, when the weather was freezing and they're on the bike for, I forgot how many, a ridiculous number of hours, climbing some massive mountain. There were several things that was fascinating. The first fascinating thing was how much they clearly enjoyed not just the memory, but they enjoyed the experience of suffering in that way. And then they segued into this wonderful conversation about all of them had now had children. And their great anxiety as a parent is that they didn't know whether they would be able to pass along, to instruct their children in the joys of suffering, which I thought was so fantastic. But it's sort of what you're getting at, right? That there's something quite unique about the mindset of these endurance heroes.
Yeah, so I heard one researcher describe this as benign masochism, that maybe one of this, we look for all the traits or the secrets or the ways that great athletes become great. And maybe one thing is that on some level, they enjoy hurting. And they don't enjoy extreme pain, but there's something about the feeling of, you hear people talk about, I felt alive during that moment. It was hard, but I felt alive. And I think, I would bet, I don't know, I would bet that someday we'll be able to identify that some people are wired to enjoy pain a little bit. But I also think we can learn that a little bit. I know for me, I share a little bit of that anxiety about how do I teach my kids that it's okay to be uncomfortable, that it can be a glorious thing to be uncomfortable. It's like, well, okay, look back, Alex. As a 12-year-old, were you like, oh, I love to suffer, I'm a Spartan, stoic, yada, yada, yada. No, I was an ordinary kid. And through a combination of circumstance and opportunity, I got into running. And I didn't love running. Initially, I loved the idea that you could stop running. That's like the best part about it. And it was only, over time that I learned to acquire a taste for it. So I think, and I bet the same is true for these cyclists, that, they probably didn't like pain. They probably weren't 6-year-olds saying, please let me stick my finger in the socket again. I just love to hurt. Mm-hmm. But it's an acquired taste.
Well, a couple of questions out of that. So my first assumption, one of the reasons that I would have had before I read your book, would be the difference between a truly elite endurance athlete or performer of any kind and me, is that they can achieve at levels without pain that I can't. In other words, that if I compare myself to the greatest distance runner in the world, they're so fit that they can run near a world record time and not actually suffer the way I suffer. But what you're saying is something different, that not only are they better physiologically, but they also suffer but are fine with it.
Yeah, this is one of the great debates, right? Like, Haile Gebrselassie ran a marathon in 2 hours. Joe Schmo ran a marathon in 4 hours. Doesn't that mean Joe Schmo is twice as tough as Haile Gebrselassie because he was out there for twice as long pushing his limits? And, there's lots of rabbit holes you can go down in that debate. But, look, there's no doubt that the greatest athletes have physical abilities that allow them to do things with ease that the rest of us can't. But I think an undersold part of that equation is, they either have learned to or are able to or have trained themselves to deal with pain. And I think, anyone who's trained for a sport for a long period of time ends up understanding that, their body has gotten bigger, stronger, tougher, whatever. But they've also learned to go into that zone of discomfort and learned the difference between a warning sign and a stop sign. They've learned that if you're breathing hard or if your legs are feeling heavy, that doesn't mean you're out of oxygen, you're about to die. It just means, this isn't sustainable indefinitely, but you can ignore it. So I do think the great athletes, they learn to tolerate. They don't necessarily feel pain differently than the rest of us, but they frame it differently. It's information, and as a result, they can stay in that pain cave for longer.
Now, how good of an understanding do we have of that process? So you've suggested that some part of it might be a learned adaptation. I'm assuming some part of that might also be just a straight up innate difference. Can we say with confidence that the act of continuously and over a long period of time testing the outer limits of your thresholds can raise your threshold for pain?
Yeah, this is relatively recent stuff. Like, there's a study that goes back to the early 80s with swimmers, elite swimmers in Scotland, where they tested pain sensitivity. It's actually pretty brutal. You put a blood pressure cuff around your arm, and you have to squeeze a contraction every second until you can't take it anymore. So it's really pushed to the limits, and it gets very painful. So they found that pain tolerance ebbed and flowed with the competitive season. So they were able to, not just were they able to swim better in the middle of their competitive season, they were able to tolerate more ischemic pain, it's called, when they were preparing for a big race. And the lowest pain tolerance was after their off season. So even within elite athletes, it rises and falls. And more recently, there's been some studies where they show that if you take people and you train them physically, their tolerance to other kinds of pain. So it's not just within the sport. Their generalized pain tolerance increases, and it increases specifically in proportion to how much they suffer in training. You can do different kinds of training that are more or less uncomfortable but achieve the same physical changes. But if you're uncomfortable, you learn to tolerate pain. The mechanisms, it's still up in the air, but the leading theory is that it's basically psychological coping mechanisms. You learn to reframe the pain or to distract yourself. It's just familiarity with discomfort.
One of the most kind of hair-raising, of the many hair-raising stories you tell in the book, is of Jens Voigt. Talk a little bit. I thought that chapter was fantastic, but tell us a little bit about that, about Voigt and his extraordinary achievement, because he bears exactly on this point of the man's tolerance or ability to reframe pain was off the charts.
That was his whole claim to fame. Is that his motto was "shut up, legs." That his legs could be screaming at him whatever they wanted, but he didn't care. He didn't want to hear it, and he credited this to his upbringing in an East German sports school. He was selected when he was quite young. And
so his era is what? When is his?
So he's in his mid-40s now. So he would have been born around 1970 or early 70s. Yeah. So towards the end, he was one of the last crop going through these East German sports schools where it was like, you better make the grade or you go back to your little town and with no opportunity for advancement and an apartment and stuff like that. And so he always felt, and there's always a little bit of self-mythology, but he always felt that he was less talented than most of his competitors, but he was just willing to hurt. And that translated into the way he rode cycling races too, is that he was never saving his energy for the end or trying to tuck in the pack. He was famous for but there's only 200 kilometers to go. All right, I'm going to make a break, and I'm going to sprint all out up this mountain to see if I can break everyone else. And so he was a total fan favorite because he was the hard man. He was the guy who was willing to suffer. And so it was perfect. In the book, I end up telling the story of him setting the hour record, because the hour, in cycling, the hour is basically very simple. How long can you cycle in an hour? And it's the ultimate test of pain, because there's no tactics, there's no teammates, there's nothing like that. And it was sort of a match made in heaven, and he broke the record by almost a mile.
Does he still hold the record?
He does not. He does not. A bunch of big guns. He did it when he was in his 41, 42, and then a bunch of big guns like Bradley Wiggins came after him, and they pushed it farther.
But his description, so when he gets off the bike, he has this description of how he felt. So give us a flavor.
He goes through every part of his body. His elbows are sore from the riding position. He's got, and in fact, the worst aerodynamic mistake he made during this record was he had to keep standing up every few laps because he was having incredible saddle sores from sitting without moving on this bike. Because you can't, in aerodynamic position, you can't even look up to see the clock. So his neck was in agony, and of course he had the whole metabolic feeling of what we traditionally call lactic acid burn. It just sounded like basically the worst thing you could ever do, and yet it was one of the greatest moments of his life.
Can we rank various endurance sports in terms of how insane their practitioners are? Because I've often thought that cyclists have a threshold for suffering that's greater than runners. Is that fair?
I think we can rank them. I think we will argue to the death about the argument. So the argument that I've heard from a bunch of people is that rowing is actually maybe the most painful thing you can do. It's like running, a 5K, except you're using your whole body. So the agony that for runners we would experience in our legs, they're experiencing throughout their whole body, just absolute, complete limits. And so they're very strong, but they're also aerobically fit enough to be able to punish themselves for 6 minutes. So it's not like one of those races that ends after 2 minutes. Now, cycling, I think, is often the races or the stages are 3, 4, 5 hours. So it's not as intense physically the whole time, but they have to be ready at all times. So I think there's a more mental aspect to cycling where they have to be out there and the amount of training time they have to accumulate.
It raises the question of whether the mythologies of the sport play into that. So when you were talking about Voigt, you said that he had a personal mythology, which was he was not as talented as everyone else, so that meant he had to work harder, right? And you can see how, if you talk about if his ability to deal with pain is as much as a matter of how he frames the experience, his personal mythology that I'm only going to win if I work harder is a crucial part of how he frames it. But it's also true of sports, right? In running, there's the category of the effortless win. There is no effortless win category in cycling, right? No one has, in the history of cycling, I swear to God, no one has ever won a Tour de France stage and said, that was super easy. But people have won, 1,500 meters at the Olympics and walked away like they just had, taken a walk in the park.
It's an interesting point. And one of the fun parts in researching the book was I read up on the hour record in cycling and read some of the historical accounts. And so a lot of people say one of the great records is Eddie Merckx in the 1970s. It was one of the great rides at the time. And again, you get this lyrical description of how incredibly painful it was from him at the end. And that's not something, that's not a subset of the running literature. Maybe marathoners, sometimes they finish and they say, I'm beat up in all these ways. But for cycling, it seems to be this sort of exquisite, symphony of pain that they experience at the end. So maybe I should respect them more than I do.
To your point about rowers, I remember once, years and years ago, I was at some conference and I met a guy who was still quite young. He was a former Olympic rower for England. And he must have been 6'4", 2 something. And he wanted to go for a run. And I was very fit at the time. It must have been in the mid-90s. We went for a run, and he's not a runner. He's 6'4", 2, he's a rower. But he was, first of all, I was like intellectually interested, how fast can I go and before he drops off? And the answer is, he never dropped off. He almost killed himself. And my whole thought was, there is no runner would ever do this. But in his world, the idea of push, I mean, now that I hear that rowing is one of the hardest, it makes perfect sense, because I was this big guy lumbering next to me at like 6-minute mile pace in 95-degree heat, and you not giving up.
Yeah, well, it shows that the mindset makes a big difference. I remember a story of a friend of mine who was, again, very fit, out for a run on a training camp in California, and this big, enormous guy, 6+, 200 and something pounds, he was about to pass him, and the guy decided to stay with him. And he thought, well, no one who's 200 something pounds is going to stay with me. I'm a elite runner. And this guy stayed with him. And after a couple miles, he said, "Who are you?" And he said, the guy introduced himself. Apparently, he was the heaviest man to break 4 minutes for the mile 10, 15 years earlier. And so he had the ability, but he also, the body type is maybe less. Different minds can inhabit different bodies.
Yeah. How do these kind of insights, how ought they change the way we train athletes, but more than athletes? You say you have 2 young daughters. Knowing what you know about endurance from this book, has it changed the way you might parent them?
It changes the way I respond to the challenge of parenting, for sure. So in the sense of dealing with my own fatigue and understanding the difference between when I feel like I can't go on, which is sort of every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday in some sense, in some ways, and what my actual limits are, and understanding that the stories I tell myself about how I'm feeling really have an effect. So if I wallow in self-pity and tell myself that no one has to work as hard as I do to bring up kids, that's going to make things a lot worse. And so that mental aspect of endurance is something that I've really taken to heart in trying to understand the power I have to reframe my own experiences. In terms of bringing up the kids, and as you were alluding to before, trying to make sure that life isn't too easy for them. They're still young right now. They're 3 and 1, so the lessons I can teach them are more along the lines of, please stop throwing that on the floor. But yeah, my youngest daughter, or my oldest daughter rather, is playing soccer, and last week we were there, and at the end she was, "I'm so tired, I can't keep going, I've been running around." Well, it's like, you're choosing to run around, but my wife is probably more hardcore than I am, and she sat her down and said, "You know what, but it's good to be tired. Doesn't it feel good? Wasn't that fun to push yourself?" And so who knows how much of that she's going to integrate. You
used a phrase earlier, the difference between, what is it, something and a stop sign, a signal?
A warning sign or an
a warning
bell,
sign.
yeah.
Can you expand on that? What is the difference between a warning sign and a stop sign?
My subjective experience of limits is that when I run a race, I'm running as hard as I can, and if someone beats me, it's because my body was incapable of doing that. And that's demonstrably not true. That we, in almost no circumstances, do we actually reach a point where our muscles can't contract anymore. Probably the most graphic illustration I can think of that is holding your breath. It's an elemental need, right? Like when I finish, if I try and hold my breath, then when I stop, I'm not thinking, well, if I really wanted it, I could push a little more. It's like, well, I'm out of oxygen.
So your body's flashing yellow is quite conservative. Your body warns you well shy of danger. So a common mistake we would make would be to assume that once the flashing yellow is there, the red is coming instantly, and it's not.
That's exactly the big idea that I took away from this book, because it's a pattern that shows up everywhere you look, whether you're running out of water, whether you're overheating. We get these warning signs, and there's still a lot of runway. And it doesn't mean in all situations you want to push into that yellow zone, if you will, but knowing that it's there gives you a little more wiggle room. And I think in any sort of context, I think also cognitive context, like the feeling of fatigue is something that I fight when I'm writing or traveling, and understanding that, okay, it's not that I'm so sleep deprived that I'm going to pass out. It just means I'm tired. It's a warning sign. I need to get some sleep, but I can push through this.
I wonder about the observation, again, to bring up, to refer to the world of running. What we've seen in running over the last 30 and 35 years is that the endurance specialties have become increasingly dominated by athletes from Africa. That's one way of framing it, that there's something about Africa. Another way of framing it is the endurance sports have become increasingly dominated by people from countries that are a lot less wealthy. And I'm wondering, are there certain habits of mind that are necessary for endurance that are getting harder and harder for wealthy countries to teach?
Yeah, so this is a $1 million question, right? And there's a lot of different answers there. I think if you look at a poverty-stricken country where there's limited opportunities, obviously there's a bunch of things going on in terms of, for a kid growing up in the United States, what are they giving up if they choose to spend their 20s running, right? Or their teens or 20s running. And also, let's say you have a 14-year-old who decides he or she wants to be a great runner. Can they just start running without getting injured if they've been sitting on at their screens through childhood? So there's a lot of stuff going on, but I don't think there's any doubt that the discomfort, learning to deal with discomfort, is something that we've programmed out of our lives. And I mean, just as a random thought, I remember 10 years ago or so taking a trip to Papua New Guinea to do a hiking trip, and I didn't have a lot of money, so we took the very difficult way of getting to the start of the hike, which was to take basically a truck for a 6-hour ride on these terrible roads. And in the back of the truck, there were maybe 25 people hanging off the roof, and we were sitting there. And it was like, we went and hiked through the jungle carrying all our stuff for a week. That was easy compared to sitting on that truck, which is a daily rite of passage for people in those communities. That's just how you get from point A to point B. And it's like, yeah, it would take me a lot to learn to be able to deal with that sort of discomfort. And so, look, I don't wish discomfort on me or on anyone, but there's certainly, I think, truth to the idea that different upbringings are going to prepare you differently for discomfort.
I want to come back to a point you were making earlier, and I want you to expand out a little bit more. So what we're suggesting here is that this ability to kind of push the envelope, to go beyond the warning sign and get to closer to the stop sign, it's cross-disciplinary. That is to say, if I learn it in one domain, it's at least of some usefulness in another domain. Is that fair to say, or do we know that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, whether it's a universal general rule, there may be some details, but there's lots of interesting studies showing that, the ability to resist mental fatigue doing computer tasks translates into the ability to resist fatigue on a bike. Various aspects of learning to deal with pain, like I was saying earlier, they transfer. It's like, just because you've learned to do a lot of bike riding or running doesn't necessarily mean that you should be able to handle electric shocks better. But it turns out that that's true. What really matters, whether you're writing a book or whether you're running a race, is not, the level of lactates in your legs or the level of caffeine in your brain. It's how hard does it feel, and how does that compare to how hard I'm willing to work. And so everything else feeds into this global sense of how hard is this. And I think that's a sort of as close to a universal law as we can get.
Does that suggest that some kind of endurance activity, maybe even endurance physical activity, ought to be considered a necessary part of a good education?
And we can speak of endurance activity broadly. Like it doesn't have to be going for a run, although I think you and I would agree that that's a fine character building activity. Mm-hmm. It could be playing games like soccer. There's lots of things, but lots of ways of getting at that skill. But I think if you don't experience discomfort on some level, you can't learn to do it without repeated exposure. So that's what I hope for my kids. Whether we can institute the compulsory phys ed again for younger kids is another question.
It's funny. Version of this for me was when I was running competitively. I was terrified of racing. I had more race anxiety than I couldn't sleep for like a week before major races. As a result, I have no anxiety in any other aspect. So I have no public speaking anxiety, none. And it's because when I stand up in front of the room, I think this is so much easier than running a race. You wrote this book over how many years?
I started telling people when I was interviewing them, it was probably 9 years ago now, that I started saying, I'm writing this book, are you willing to talk to me? So I think hopefully they're now realize that I was telling the truth. It just took a while.
So there's an astonishing amount of reporting and storytelling in this. At one point you went to the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. And I just want you to, because it was one of those, there's many like these wonderful moments in the book where you just are taken someplace that you have never seen before. Tell me about that experience and why you went and what you learned.
So, Comrades it's about a 55-mile ultramarathon in South Africa, and it's the biggest ultramarathon in the world, and it has this tremendous. It's kind of the Boston Marathon of South Africa, and now I've been to a lot of races in my life, hundreds, but this was an experience like none I've ever really had before. And as a former middle distance runner, I can say it's the first time I thought, I'd like to run an ultramarathon. I'd like to be part of this. One thing is there's like 20,000 people who run it some years, so it's a massive thing and huge support, and it takes hours and hours. The winners might run 6 hours, but the official cutoff is 12 hours. If you want to have an official time in the Comrades Marathon, you have to finish within 12 hours. And this is taken enormously seriously by people. And what they do at the finish line in the stadium, they have the finishes, I think it was finishing on a track, and they have the finish line set up. And when they get close to maybe a minute left before 12 hours, the race official stands at the finish line with his back facing the oncoming runners so that he won't see them and be biased by them. And he holds a gun in the air, and the whole stadium starts counting down. And you can see all the runners who were sort of straggling into the stadium realizing, oh, I have 46, 45, 44 seconds remaining to be an official finisher. And these guys have been out there for 11 hours and 59 minutes. They are just wrecked. They are the detritus of human existence. And they start sprinting, and it looks like you would imagine, the race of the zombies looking. They're just, trying to get there, and they are sprinting. And then the gun is in the air, 3, 2, 1. The gun goes off, and a bunch of race marshals jump across the finish line and join arms so that no one else can cross the finish line. And when the year I saw it, one guy made it, he ran basically 11:59:59, and someone else who would have been basically 12:00:01 bounced off these guys and just heeled over backwards. And he still gets to cross the line. He knows he did it, but there was something about this sense of this achievement meant so much to so many people that and they took seriously the difference between making it and not making it. And the guy who ran 12:00:001 will be back the next year. So and that's on my bucket list. Is I would love to experience that race because you could see it had so much meaning to people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex. And I hardly recommend Endure to anyone out there who wants a fantastic read.
Wonderful. Thank you.